A boy wakes up at sea to a terrifying sight. A hyena has emerged from inside the boat. The boy is immediately paralyzed with fear and quickly grabs an oar to defend himself. But the hungry hyena is too ferocious, forcing the boy to flee, clinging tightly to a wooden pole at the back of the boat for safety. Fortunately, the African hyena suffers from seasickness on his first boat ride. Unable to stand on his feet due to the unstable ocean vibration, the hyena stares at its prey and decides to wait until nightfall before attacking, then returns to the boat. Seeing this, the boy finally breathes a sigh of relief, but at that moment he notices a monkey floating near him. What is happening? The boy looks closely and realizes that he is riding a bunch of bananas. He saves the monkey. Now the boy is stranded at sea with 3 animals. This is a story about a boy who drifts at sea, but when you really understand it, it is not just a survival movie, it is a horrific horror story. And it all starts with the boy Pai Patel. He was originally on a ship with his family of 3, immigrating to Canada. But one night, as the ship was passing over the deepest part of the ocean, Pai was awakened by a loud noise, while his family continued to sleep. Out of curiosity, he went to the deck to check, only to find the ship battered by waves and about to capsize. Pai found a crew member nearby and asked what was happening. Before he could get an answer, he was pushed into a lifeboat. Before Pai could respond, a zebra suddenly jumped into the lifeboat. In the blink of an eye, the small boat was swept away by the waves. As Pai regained his footing, he saw that most of the ship had already sunk into the sea. At that moment, he noticed a figure in the distance. Pai quickly threw a lifebuoy, but as the figure approached, it turned out to be a tiger named Richard. The tiger jumped onto the small boat, and a terrified Pai crawled to the stern, clinging to a wooden pole, and survived the night. At dawn, he noticed that the tiger was nowhere to be found, leading to the scene at first. Pai had no idea that the tiger had not left. By nightfall, the hyena had fully adapted to the sea and his seasickness had subsided. Unable to reach Pai, he turned his attention to the injured zebra. Pai roared in protest but was powerless to stop the brutal scene. Pai could only watch in horror. To avoid being killed by the hyena, he retreated to the stern again and survived another night. By the next day, Pai, completely exhausted, accidentally fell into the sea. He quickly got up, looked towards the boat to find the zebra already dead, but the monkey had somehow survived. Pai realized that he could not sit there any longer, thinking about the weapons on board. Gathering his courage, and while the hyena was not looking, he found a survival manual in a cupboard. He quickly leafed through it and then made a makeshift lifeboat according to the instructions. He planned to leave the boat temporarily with the monkey, but the hyena suddenly rushed out. To protect Pai, the monkey engaged in a fierce battle with the hyena. He knocked the hyena down with a punch and Pai could only cheer. But within seconds, the hyena grabbed the monkey by the throat and killed him instantly. When Pai saw this, he became angry and wanted to take revenge on the monkey. Unexpectedly, Richard appeared and quickly killed the hyena. Pai was immediately terrified and quickly pushed the lifeboat out to sea, then jumped out of the small boat. Fortunately, Richard, the king of the jungle, was also reluctant to enter the water. Thus, Pai was temporarily safe on his lifeboat. While Richard was sleeping, Pai sneaked into the boat and found several cans of food. He carried some of the food to the raft. Hungry, Pai immediately opened a biscuit and began to eat, despite the danger. At that moment, Pai discovered a mouse on the boat, but its squeaking woke up the sleeping Richard. Richard tried to eat Pai, but his clumsy movements prevented him from crossing. Pai thought he was safe, when suddenly he saw Richard change his tactics. In a moment of desperation, Pai grabbed the mouse and threw it into Richard's mouth, then quickly jumped into the raft. Since the zebra's corpse was still on the boat, Richard temporarily saved Pai. That night, Richard stood on the edge of the boat, staring intently at his prey. Pai burst into tears. If he moved away from the boat, he wouldn't be able to store food there. If he didn't leave, the hungry Richard would eventually eat him. After a night of contemplation, Pai made a bold decision to tame Richard, following the instructions in the manual. The first step was to choose a calm day, position the lifeboat against the wind, making it as stable and comfortable as possible, and then blow the whistle. The second step was to turn the boat sideways toward the waves and continue to blow the whistle. This way, Richard would associate the sound with seasickness and discomfort. But the most important step was yet to come. Pai mustered up his courage and urinated on the boat to mark his territory. But Richard didn't react. Instead, he seemed to mock Pai's actions. Although these risky steps didn't work, Pi didn't give up. He even started sharing the fresh water he collected with Richard and tried using biscuits to catch fish, all in order to ensure his survival. Richard needed about 5 pounds of meat a day, and if it got too hungry, it would attack him. But despite his continuous attempts for days and nights, Pi had no luck in catching any fish, and finally, the thing Pi feared the most happened. One day, Richard could no longer bear his hunger, so he jumped into the sea. Pi was stunned with fear. The clumsy Richard couldn't catch a fish at all. Pi, who was watching from the side, couldn't help but laugh at his awkward attempts, but his laughter didn't last long because Richard quickly set his sights on him and started swimming towards him. Terrified, Pi quickly pulled the rope, jumped onto the small boat before Richard could reach him, then lifted the raft onto the boat, leaving Richard lost in the water. Richard was now like a lamb to the altar in the sea. Pi raised an axe, ready to end Richard's life, but at that moment Richard suddenly acted kindly. He had never killed before. Pi hesitated, and after a long moment of hesitation, he couldn't bring himself to do it. As night fell, Richard had been soaking in the sea for a day. To prevent Richard from dying in the water, Pi transferred all the food from the boat to the raft and then pushed the raft back into the sea. Not knowing that this act would be something he would regret, he then lowered a wooden plank, allowing Richard to as he got into the small boat while he returned to the raft. And so, the man and the tiger continued their journey in the sea. One day, Pi suddenly noticed a large fish swimming in his net. He quickly grabbed it and then hit it repeatedly with a hammer until it became lifeless, and its body turned from green to gray. Pi shed sad tears because this was the first time he had killed anything. And Pi was a vegetarian who had never eaten meat before. He threw the entire fish to Richard. That night, the sea was filled with glowing jellyfish, a scene of breathtaking beauty. Like a curious child, Pi reached out to the sea, waving his hand happily across the water. But he did not know that behind the beauty lay danger. Suddenly, a whale broke through the surface. Its huge body caused waves that overturned the entire raft. Pi's survival biscuits were all lost in the sea. He regretted moving all the food to the raft, but it was too late. Hunger is a terrifying thing. It can completely change a person. Pi gathered his courage and climbed into the small boat. Richard, thinking that his meal had been arrived, he prepared to attack, but then a small fish suddenly slapped Pi in the face. While the man and the tiger were stunned for a moment, a huge school of fish appeared, flying towards them. At that moment, a tuna suddenly jumped onto the boat. While Richard was preparing to eat it, Pi knew that he could not show weakness. He grabbed a stick and thrust it into Richard's mouth. Surprised by Pi's violent attitude, Richard retreated and obediently ate the small fish that landed on the boat. That night, after cleaning the tuna, Pi ate it greedily. Getting enough food was not enough. Pi knew that in order to survive, he had to tame Richard. So he bravely climbed onto the small boat and began to train Richard with the stick. Pi only cried out, and Richard was already obedient like a kitten. Then Pi took out a piece of fish from his bag and offered it to Richard with the stick. To his surprise, after eating it, Richard, like a duck at home, pointed for more. When he saw it, Pi threw another piece to him. It seemed that Richard had been successfully tamed now. But Pi did not relax his caution. He returned to the raft. At that moment, a group of dolphins appeared in the distance. Pi was happy that a ship was visible behind the dolphins. He quickly fired a light signal into the sky, hoping that the ship would notice, but unfortunately, after firing 10 light signals, only one remained, and the ship did not notice the distress signal. And eventually, it faded from Pi's sight. At that moment, he felt completely hopeless. In that night, the man and the tiger looked up at the stars, wondering when this drift would end. Little did they know, the weather at sea could change in an instant. The once clear sky turned into a storm, and the waves battered the small boat, threatening to capsize at any moment. Pi, unwilling to give up, roared angrily at the sky. The man and the tiger gathered in the boat's cabin, hoping that the storm would pass quickly. Who knows how long it lasted, but finally the sea calmed down, but their previously stored food had been washed away. A month later, Pi had become a shadow of his former self, and Richard was on the verge of death. Pi drank a mouthful of seawater, but it did not quench his thirst. When he saw the weak Richard in front of him, Pi poured all the remaining water into Richard's mouth. Pi then treated him like a companion and carried him in his arms with love. Pi shed tears of frustration. After more than 100 days at sea, they could not hold out any longer, but when Pi woke up, he found that they had drifted to an island. He quickly climbed ashore, saw the green plants in front of him, and began to devouring it, not caring if it was poisonous. He was very hungry. After filling his stomach, he ventured further into the island. When he came out of the jungle, Pi was stunned. The island was teeming with meerkats, and around them were many pools of water. The exhausted Pi jumped, swimming around happily. The feeling of survival was unbelievable. Richard was even more excited because the island was an endless buffet. Pi found a place to tie the necklace his girlfriend had given him. With the abundance of food on the island, he thought of staying there. But the impending danger quickly changed Pi's mind. At sunset, the meerkats seemed to sense danger. They all climbed the trees to hide, while Richard returned to the small boat. At first, Pi did not pay much attention and continued to play with the little animals, but in the middle of the night, he discovered that the fish in the pools had all floated to the surface, dead. Upon closer inspection, he realized that the sweet, drinkable water from the day had turned into a highly corrosive acid. By nightfall, Pi picked up a glowing flower, and when he opened it, he found a human tooth inside. Pi realized that the island was not safe for long-term habitation, and his suspicions were confirmed. Looking from the distance, the shape of the island resembled that of a reclining woman. The next day, Pi gathered a large amount of food and water, then blew his whistle. To his surprise, Richard came running at the sound. And so, the man and the tiger set off on their journey once again. After countless days and nights, Pi finally washed up on the shore. He was so exhausted that he could no longer stand, but Richard seemed to be watching him. In much better shape, he even slowly stretched out before heading towards the forest. But when he reached the edge of the forest, Richard stopped. Pi thought that Richard might turn to look at him, to somehow say goodbye, but Richard did not look back and disappeared into the forest. When Pi was finally rescued, he cried like a baby. After 223 days together, Pi had developed a deep bond with Richard, but Richard had left his life without even saying goodbye. Thanks for watching.